And at this point, I think we can thank Maren and give the floor to Myriam Silvera.
Myriam,
Myriam.
ci sono. Ci sei. Allora, Myriam è professore presso l'Università
Myriam
di
is a
Roma Tor
professor at the
Vergata,
University of Rome Tor
coordina il
Vergata. She
diploma
coordinates
universitario triennale in
the
studi ebraici
three-year
e il
university
master in
diploma in
cultura ebraica
Judaic
della
studies and the
Unione delle
masters
Comunità Ebraiche
in
Italiane. È
Judaic culture
studiosa della
for
filosofia
the
del
Italian Jewish
Seicento
community.
e
She
in
studies
particolare della
17th century
filosofia
philosophy,
ebraica del
and in
XVI e
particular
XVII secolo. Si è
Jewish
occupata di
philosophy
autori quali Del
in that
Medico.
period.
Ha però
And
anche
she's dealt with
lavorato
authors
sulla
like Del Medico,
ricezione
but
di
she also
Filone in
worked
età
on the
moderna.
reception of Philo in the modern
Oggi
age.
ci parla di De
Today,
Josepho e
she
Legatio
will
ad
be talking
Gaium,
to us about De
modelli di
Josepho and
dirigenza politica.
Legatio at
Prego.
Gaium as models of political.
A tutti
I'd
gli
like to thank Professor
organizzatori per
Massimo
avermi
Gargiulo and
invitato a
all the
partecipare a
organizers for
questo
having invited
interessante
me to take
convegno.
part in this
Il
interesting
De Josepho, su cui in
conference.
questi
De
giorni abbiamo
Josepho,
soffermato la nostra
which we
attenzione,
focused on
acquista nuova
over
luce
these
se letto
days,
in relazione al
acquires
viaggio che
a
Filone
new
compì a
light if
Roma.
you
Come
read it in
autorevole
relation to
componente di una
the journey
delegazione degli
to
ebrei di Alessandria
Rome by
che chiese
Philo as an
udienza
authoritative
all'imperatore
member of the
Caligola
delegation of
dopo i
Jews in Alexandria,
devastanti tumulti
which
antiebraici del
sought a
38.
audience with
Come è noto, ne
Emperor
sono
Caligula
rimaste due
after the devastating
testimonianze,
anti-Jewish
la
riots of
Legatio
year 38.
ad Gaium
As
e
we
in
know,
Flaccum,
two
che io di seguito citerò nella
things have
traduzione di
remained
Clara
from that,
Corsi e
Legatio at
Gaium.
Gaium and
Questi
in
scritti,
Flaccum.
risalenti probabilmente al
These
medesimo arco cronologico delle
works, which
biografie
probably
e
are
in
from
particolare per
the
quanto ci
same
riguarda quasi
period of the
contemporanee a De
biographies and
Josepho, si veda
almost contemporary
l'articolo
with De
sbagliato che appunto di
Josepho.
Maren
You can
ecco,
consult on
hanno
that
in comune
Marenikov's
diversi passi
intellectual
attraverso
biography,
i quali Filone
share a
esprime il
number of
modello del buon
passages where Philo
politico,
expresses the model of the
opponendolo al
good
profilo di chi, al
statesman,
contrario,
opposing
cade
this to the
preda di
profile of
vizi,
who,
di mancanza di
conversely,
moderazione
falls
e
prey
della
of vices,
temperanza
lack of
necessaria a un buon
moderation,
governo.
and the requisite
Un vero
temperance for good
politico è un buon
governance.
pastore, secondo
A
Filone,
good statesman
un'immagine
is a
molto
good shepherd,
frequente
according to
che
Philo, which is a
ricorre
very
tanto nel
frequent
De
image,
Josepho che
which we
nella
find both in De
Legatio
Josepho
e
and
che ha
in the
nel De
Legatio,
Somnis,
and
libro
which
2,
in De
152 e
Somnis, Book 2, 152 to
154,
154,
una declinazione strettamente
a
pertinente ai
analysis which
contesti che
is
qui ci interessano.
very relevant to the
Lo
context we
ricorda
are
Francesca
concerned
Calabi
with here. This
nel
is something
suo
which
Somma
Francesca
Novatatis
Calabi
Filone, a
has
proposito
pointed
della
out in her
descrizione
biography of
filoniana
Philo
delle conseguenze
concerning the
dell'illimitato e
Philo's description of
disordinato
the
potere delle
consequences of
masse.
unlimited
Cito,
and
finché le
unregulated power of the
mandrie dei
masses.
buoi
I
ubbidiscono ai
quote,
mandiani,
as long
le
as
greggi
the
di
herds of
pecore
oxen
o di capre ai
obey the
pecorari o ai
herdsmen
caccai,
and
per
the
loro
herds
tutto va
flocks of
bene.
sheep
Ma
to
quando gli uomini,
the
preposti alla guida del
shepherds,
bestiame,
but
divengono
everything goes well. But
proteggevoli degli
when
animali,
the
tutto
men who
languisce.
are to guide their
È
livestock
lontano
become
dal
weaker
rischio
than
di
the
venire
animals, everything
assimilato agli animali
goes
il Giuseppe
awry.
di Filone,
It's
mentre
far from
Caligola
the
di
risk of
Filone,
being
il
assimilated
Caligola della
to
Legatio ad
animals,
Gaium, con il suo
Joseph or
dissoluto
Philo, whereas
comportamento,
Philo's
sta
Caligula, with
progressivamente
his
perdendo le redini. Se ne accorge il
unregulated
suo
behavior,
consigliere
is
Macrone
progressively
che gli
losing the
suggerisce
reins
all'orecchio
of
doveri
his
e
people.
comportamenti
And
del
this is
buon
something which his
governante.
counselor
In
Macro,
questo
who
lungo
whispers
richiamo
the
che
duties and
Filone mette
the
in bocca a
conduct of a
Macrone
good
e che
governor.
procurerà sempre nella
This
ricostruzione
place,
filoniana
the
la disgrazia di
words which
quest'ultimo,
Philo will
è
put
stata
in
individuata
the
una
mouth
grande
of Macro
affinità con la seconda
shows
digressione del De
it has been
Josepho.
said, a great
È
affinity
però
with
da
the second
notare che
digression of the
nella
Josepho.
Legatio c'è un accento
However, we should note
diverso
that in
che
the
conferisce all'attività
Legatio there's a
politica maggiore
different emphasis
importanza,
which
in
gives greater
quanto, cito,
importance to
l'arte del
political
governo
activity
rappresenta
because, and
la
I'm
più
quoting the art
alta
of
e la
government,
più nobile
I'm
di
quoting,
tutte le
the art of
arti.
government represents the
Legatio
highest and the most noble of
47.
all arts,
Non è
Legatio
allora un caso
47.
che, mentre in
So it's no
entrambi gli
coincidence that
scritti
whereas
il
in
buon
both
governante
texts
deve essere
the
appunto un
good
buon
governor should
pastore,
be a good
un
shepherd,
altro carattere del saggio
another
uomo
feature
politico, quella
of
del
the
buon
wise
timoniere,
political man, the good helmsman, is presented differently in De Josepho, where the helmsman adjusts his course according to the winds, Josephus 33, and in the Legatio, where the route to salvation is already indicated in perspective. Macro says to Caligula, accordingly, having under nature's escort risen to the highest post in the stern and the tiller placed in your hand, steer in security the common ship of mankind, rejoicing and delighting in nothing so much as in benefiting your subjects. The helmsman who changes and is in relation to the political life, which is various and multiform, and the gift of the famous coat of colors which Jacob gives to his son Joseph. And then one detail, and we'll come back to this later, the route which leads Philo from Joseph sold into slavery and unresponsive to the temptation of the wife of Potiphar, and the political man who, unlike the demagogue, does not become the slave of the crowds, giving in to the contingent desires and passions of them. This is something which come back more extensively in the second digression, where the contrast between the figure of the physician comes in, which we heard in the first presentation of this meeting, and the head cook who only thinks of satisfying the palate of his clients. The good politician, aware of the despotic power of the people, concedes nothing to them. Josepho 69. This denunciation of uncontrollable power of the crowd is expressed extensively in the Flacum, the maker of the anti-Jewish riots which occurred in Alexandria. For Philo, I quote, is not the orderly people, but the crowd which regularly fills everything with confusion and turmoil. The plunders, the killings, the tortures of all kinds had occurred under the eyes of the prefect of Egypt, Avidius Flaccus, identified as the first person responsible for the facts. Here, because he was seeking alliances with the crowd, did not restore order, something would have asked only 1 hour, Philo says. The theses which are developed by Owen Goodenough in his Politics of Philo Judaeus connect De Josephus with the political episodes which saw Philo as a protagonist of his time.
Goodenough perspectives, as is well known, identifies in Philo a fierce and firm hostility to the Roman power that would express itself in many different ways and contexts. Within this general perspective, there is an interesting and subsequently much contested observation by Goodenough. The term with which Philo indicates the superintendence entrusted to Josephus over all Egypt, epitrope, Josephus 117, closely resembles the term epitropos, with which Philo indicates Flaccus, who, as we said, was the prefect of Egypt, while, according to Goodenough, in the allegorical writings, Josephus would represent all the evil of Rome. Here, in the De Josepho, he would represent what Flaccus is not, becoming almost the anti-model of Flaccus, given that the latter falls concretely in front of those risks and temptations that present themselves to the politician in contact with the masses, but that Josephus, a good politician, would know how to manage brilliantly. Within a year of the publication of the Good Enough study that was published in 1938, this stunt was already subjected to intense philological criticism. We find evidence of this in at least two journals, the American Journal of Philology and the Classical Philology. In the former, Ralph Marcus argues, amongst other things, that Petronius, prefect of Syria, is also called Epitropos, or in the latter journal, Max Radan argues that the official title of prefect Philos at that time was not Epitropos but Upharos and Hegemon. The objections to these identifications have then continued over the years. Yet, despite the criticism, the thesis of the approximation of roles between Flaccus and Josephus, and at the same time the reversed interpretation and application of these roles by each one of them, would account for that tortuous Philonian passage, which, from the slavery of Josephus, arrives at the risk of the politician man becoming the slave of masses, a passage that I have commented above. I should also note that this discussion around the term epitropos would have had no reason to exist if Philo had found the term in the Genesis 41, verse 40-41, where the Pharaoh gives Joseph this commission, would have found the term epitropos or epitrophe, whilst Philo could have found instead in the Septuagint a turn of phrase corresponding to the Hebrew. Pharaoh, in fact, says to Joseph, I will be superior to you only for the throne or in the throne. In Hebrew, rakakise egdal minecha. Thus Philo evidently chose the term with which to designate the office held by Josephus. If it is possible to accept this proposal by good enough without agreeing with the general structure of his reconstruction of the political Philo in an anti-Roman perspective, then it seems to me that one can even more reasonably, if not agree, at least take into consideration the conclusions he draws from this discourse.
Egypt had at least once been ideally governed by a Jew.
And she was reading it in English. So it was worthwhile to remind the Gentiles that Egypt had at least once been ideally governed by a Jew. Just as the attention to the historical and political reality in which Philo participates enlightens the interpretation of the Josepho, so too the figure of Philo receives new light through his ambassadorship to Gaius. Philo here is the representative of the Jews, first of Alexandria, then of the entire diaspora, charged with dealing with the power with the capital P. In this sense, he is more reminiscent of Moses than Josephus. Whilst Moses persuaded the Pharaoh through miracles and wonders, Philo instead attempts to persuade his interlocutor by drawing on a refined and subtle dialectic. Aware of the fact of Caligula's personalism, Philo stresses that the destruction of the Alexandrian synagogues is in fact constituting a damage to the person of the emperor, because in those synagogues people prayed for his well-being and for his prosperity. And here I quote, "You have failed to see what you are not adding, but taking from the honor given to our masters. And you do not understand that everywhere in the habitable world, the religious venerations of the Jews for the Augustan house has its basis, as all may see in the meeting houses. And and then Flaccus 49, and the pages of Agrippa's alleged letter to Gaius Caligula in defense of the sanctity of the Temple of Jerusalem, where it would have been unacceptable to introduce a statue of the emperor, pages that are clearly the product of Philo's pen, represent an effective political and rhetorical device. Coming from a Jewish king who, incidentally, does not remind us of Josephus at all, they could sound more authoritative. And as in previous parts of the Legatio, they emphasize the special attention of Augustus given to the Temple of Jerusalem, where he had ordered daily sacrifices to be made at his own expense. The figure of the so-called political leader who acts in favor of his Jewish co-religionists become even more vivid in the image of those Roman Jews who live as prisoners of war released by their own masters, who live beyond the river Tiber, who have their own synagogues, and who periodically send their tribute to Jerusalem with the tacit consent of Augustus. This is in Legatio 155-157. In this case, Augustus is given almost an ante litteram defense of the Jew who lives in the diaspora, with his gaze on Jerusalem, without being guilty of a lack of loyalty to his country of residence. And here we see the leader political Philo. So here I quote, Augustus knew that they collect money for sacred purposes for their first fruit and send them to Jerusalem. Yet, nevertheless, he neither ejected them from Rome nor deprived them of their Roman citizenship, because they were not claiming their own Jewish affiliation. Let me just say that Philo was devoting a lot of space to Philo, praising his politics in the civil, legislative, and building area. And he says that he was an admirable ruler of government, and that his pro-Jewish politics was falling in the framework of his own political objectives. Augustus, to the eyes of Philo, is not a good governor or ruler because he's adopting a pro-Jewish politics, but rather he adopts it because he's a good ruler. And Clara Claus Reggiani wrote in the preface of her edition to the Legatio at Gaium and in Flaccum, "The search for topicality in antiquity is one that will never end." Certainly, the scholar was also stressing that the ancient must be studied in its specificity, something that we all recognize, and this is what Kraus-Reggiani did with Philo. And then after having delved into the many faces of the Josepho, the language, the sources, the fortune in the Christian and Islamic sphere, we can, turning to the political Philo, we can think back to the many subsequent occasions on which a Jewish delegation went to meet the political authority, to ask to prevent imminent persecution, to stop violence, or to claim freedoms of worship. We can then recall the representatives of the Spanish Jewish community who in 1492 went to Isabella of Castile in an attempt to revoke the edict of expulsion of the Jews from Spain, or the delegation that left in 1656 from Amsterdam to ask Cromwell and the English Parliament for the right to establish a Jewish community in London.
diciamo così, tipologica,
so to say, typological interpretation is already to be found in several passages of the rabbinic literature. For example, in the Babylonian Talmud, the treatise Milas 17 AB, where some rabbis, including Shimon bar Yochai, go to Rome to avert 3 decrees that hinder their religious freedom. They access and enter the imperial residence, where they drive out a demon, Bentemalion, that had entered the body of the emperor's daughter, and thus, having gained the emperor's gratitude, can then tear up the 3 decrees.
Grazie.
Thank you for
molto
this very beautiful presentation. We now allow a couple of questions. And for those who wish to ask questions, please remember to raise your hand or to write your question in the chat space.
Grazie Myriam.
Many thanks, Myriam.
Vorrei dire due cose.
Let me say a couple of things.
Josephus
Josephus Flavius says in the Contrapion
le critiche dei egiziani
that the criticism coming from the Egyptians
solamente perché hanno conosciuto il Josepho
came about only because they came to know the Joseph, who was the ruler of their own country. It is very interesting that Josephus Flavius was maybe thinking in sort of a parallel way, as you did. And another thing is that Shimon bar Yochai in the Talmud is very interesting, I think, because Shimon bar Yochai is from Israel, and in the Jerusalem Talmud, all of the Midrashim do not find this hint concerning Rome, and only in Bavel the scholars thought of Shimon bar Yochai as someone who was related and relating to Rome. I would like to know how to explain this. Why would you think that? Why did you think that they started thinking of Shimon bar Yochai to Rome in Bavel? Well, in the first thing, as I said, this is a typological interpretation, so we shouldn't ascribe to it a historical meaning or significance, because if we do so, then we are misled. We are going to be easily misled, especially when starting off from the Talmud. The first instinct is the one of thinking of the decrees and try and have our information overlap with the given decree having to do with the prohibition of the Shabbat, of circumcision, and with respect to the norms of sexual purity. Now, to answer your question, what I think is that this did happen in a later moment, this kind of treaty and agreement with the emperor. There may be a chronological difference, I believe, substantially, because the Talmud is anterior and precedes it. But maybe you would explain this in a different way. Have you got a different explanation? With Shimon bar Yochai, I think it's not a chance that his first attribution was the one of Shimon bar Yochai. I believe that it's interesting. It is interesting that he became a hero, an anti-Roman hero. But in the Babylonian Talmud, there are parts that are very much favorable to Rome, to the Roman matrons that were very helpful and intervening positively. Many hints are given to the richness and wealth of Rome. There is a midrash that says that the silver and gold that Joseph had collected in Egypt and was passing from the hands of people and then in the end ended up in Rome.
Sì, molto, molto interessante. Sì.
Very interesting indeed, as a theme, I mean.
Sì, veramente grazie per questo
Yes, thank you for
citazione
this
che
further
allarga il
quotation, which
discorso
is extending
delle
the
prospettive che non
horizon and the
sempre
perspectives,
sono
which
conosciute e
are not
ovvie.
always well
Abbiamo
known
ancora
nor well
qualche
understood
minuto
or
per
obvious.
un'altra domanda, se qualcuno
Maybe we
desidera
still have time
intervenire.
for another question, should there be another one. Just let me greet the Bishop of Rimini, His Eminence, Monsignor Francesco Lambiasi, who just logged in, and we wanted to just greet him. So please, Francesco, now you have the floor.
Grazie. Sì, io volevo
Thank you.
chiedere,
Yes, what I wanted
nell'ottica
to
di
ask
Macrone,
is
Caligula rappresenta il
according
potere
to the eyes of
imperiale, il suo
Macron,
ruolo è quello di
Caligula is representing the
regnante,
imperial
modello per
power,
i
the
sudditi che ha il
king, the
compito di
model for
insegnare
the
come farsi
subjects,
migliori.
and he has the
Ora,
task of
se
teaching
capisco
them
bene la
something,
tua tesi,
giving an example. Now,
tu
if I do understand your
pensi
own
che
thesis and
mentre
ideas, you believe
Giuseppe
that
nel De
whilst
Josepho si
Joseph in the
limita a
Josepho
cercare
is
di migliorare
confining
situazioni
himself to
precarie,
improving precarious
però con degli
situations
interventi parziali,
with very partial
l'esortazione di
interventions,
Macrone
the
avrebbe un
exhortations of
obiettivo e
Macron
un'aura più alta,
would rather be
cioè
much more
mirerebbe al
far-reaching.
governo più nobile e
That
al pieno
is, they aim
interesse dei
at having a
sudditi.
more noble
Cioè, nel primo
government is to the
caso
full interest of the
si
subjects.
avrebbe una ricerca
In the first case,
concreta
we
di un
would
bene
have a
possibile, nel
concrete search
secondo
of a concrete
una
good.
sorta di
In the second
aspirazione
case,
ideale, e
it
questa è
is
un po'
sort
la
of an ideal
tua
aspiration, I believe.
ipotesi.
And I think that this is your hypothesis, if I didn't get you wrong.
Di questa traduzione.
Yes, thank you very much for your own
Che parte in effetti da queste
translation,
penso che
which
partano un po'
stems out of
da queste
the
osservazioni
same
che facevo sul diverso
observation
senso
that
che ha
was
l'uso
made on the
del
different
paragone con
meaning,
il buon
which
timoniere.
makes a comparison with
Io
the good
trovo in effetti
helmsman,
che
the use
nella
that we make of
Legatio
the good
ci sia
helmsman.
una
And in the Legatio, I
valutazione
believe that there is an
dell'attività politica,
evaluation of the political
del
activity
ruolo politico
and of the
molto
political
più
role,
ampia
which
e
is
una
broader
difesa molto
and more
più
extended.
ampia e articolata, cioè ci
It's
sia
even more
molta più
articulated,
fiducia
meaning that there is much more
nell'attività politica
trust
rispetto
placed in the political
al De
activity
Josepho, dove
as opposed to what happens with
comunque
the
diciamo è
Josepho.
un'attività
And I
rischiosa, è sempre
believe that this is
sottoposta
a
a
risky
rischio,
activity. It's always subject to
mentre
risks, in other
la
words.
possibilità di un buon
Whilst the
governo non è
possibility
più
of a
solo
good
una
government
possibilità
is no
nella
longer a
Legatio, perché
possibility of the
abbiamo questa
Legatio,
immagine di Augusto che
because we have
governa
this image of
splendidamente,
Augustus,
facendo
who is ruling wonderfully
appunto una profonda trasformazione della stessa città
and
di
brings about a
Alessandria,
deep
una
transformation of
difesa
Alexandria, the
della
city,
giustizia, l'applicazione delle
aiming at
leggi,
justice, the
e
implementation
anche
of the
Caligola,
laws.
appena
And
prende il
Caligula,
potere,
as soon as he is
si trova
empowered,
in eredità una situazione molto
finds himself
ordinata, una
inheriting a
situazione
very orderly
idilliaca in cui le
situation,
persone
a
sono
sort of
felici, in cui non
idylliac,
c'è
where
il
people are
ricco e il
happy,
povero,
where there are no
ci sono
riches
le
and no
persone che sono
poors.
estremamente
There
devote,
are people
c'è
that
un
are very
clima di
devout.
pace.
The climate
Cioè
is a
sembra che
climate of peace.
concretamente sia
In other words, it
possibile
seems that it is concretely possible
un governante, un governo, un
to
governante
have a government
che
and a
riesca
governor, a ruler,
veramente a raggiungere la
actually
salvezza del
capable
popolo, il
of
benessere del popolo.
obtaining salvation
E
of people, the
penso,
well-being of
però
people.
devo verificare poi
But
questa ipotesi,
I
penso
think,
che
and I have to verify
nel
my
De Josepho
hypothesis,
c'è
but
un
I
po'
think
questa
that in the De
bipolarità
Josepho
tra
there is a sort of a
il governante e le
dualism
masse,
between the
governante e
ruler
masse.
and the
Non c'è il
masses.
popolo ordinato che
You don't
compare
see the
invece nella
ordained people
Legatio.
that instead is
C'è
appearing in the
l'esempio
Legatio.
del popolo,
There
della
is the
massa,
example of
diciamo
the
così, che
mass
cresce, che però
that
sono i
grows,
carcerieri, quei carcerieri di cui
represented by the
parlava
jailers. The
Haydn sul
jailers
bellissimo intervento
mentioned
di
by
ieri, no?
Haydn in his
I
beautiful
carcerieri
intervention made yesterday.
crescono,
The
si
jailers
evolvono, acquistano
grow,
virtù,
evolve, gain
grazie
virtues
all'esempio di
thanks to the
Giuseppe nel
example
De
of
Josepho,
Joseph
no?
in the Josepho.
Progrediscono nella
They
virtù i carcerieri,
progress
però i carcerieri stanno in
into
prigione,
virtue.
cioè
but nonetheless they are in prison. Jailers are not a political subject, and it seems that the mass, the political subject which is seen in people, seems to be intervening more in the Legatio instead. But I think that I still have to verify and delve into this aspect, I believe. Thank you.